Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Grayzone. It's Max Blumenthal here with Aaron Mate, as always. Sorry to keep you all waiting. I actually had a little power issue that kept one of my lights off, and I didn't want to look like Bela Lugosi when we went live. So thank you for being so patient with us. We're now on Rockfin, Rumble, Twitter. Aaron, do you do Thanksgiving in Canada? Do Canadians do Thanksgiving? I know you had an indigenous genocide there as well.
There is a Canadian Thanksgiving. It's it's actually about a month earlier than the U.S. version, and it's not as big a deal. Nobody really observes it. It's not like no one's forced to go be with their relatives, unlike in the U.S.
Yeah.
Although if you watch MSNBC these days, like you'll hear I don't know, Joy Reid saying, "Don't go if any of your relatives or friends voted for Trump. Do not see them for Thanksgiving. Isolate them. Don't talk to them." Basically, as any cult elder would instruct their flock. So maybe Thanksgiving attendance was down this year if people listen to MSNBC.
Yeah. Or you'd be totally alone if you're like a hick lib. You know, the hick libs, they like hate all their relatives and like do TikTok videos about it. They're like the bearded liberal guys, and they're like, all my relatives are on opioids, and they're talking about, I mean, they make some good points, but they would have been alone if they followed Joy Reid's advice. I also saw a lot of people who supported Kamala, or some people, complaining about genocide in the US after basically supporting the successor of Genocide Joe. So it's always funny to see that. When we were young in public school, we learned that the Indians and the Pilgrims just sat down together and had a nice dinner. And it was like really setting the psychological stage for the Israel-Palestine peace process, where everything's just equally balanced and we just need to sit down at the table and work everything out. Everybody's entitled to a piece of the land. After Thanksgiving, which, it's the beginning of the holidays, which I also call surviving the game, was consumed with the really important news of the week. And I assigned our open source intelligence team to investigate by watching the video again and again of the alleged sex tape between Destiny and Nick Fuentes. This is something really critical to our viewers. So we'll be turning around an investigation on that shortly. Aaron, will you be able to will you be able to come to the watch party?
This is the first time hearing of this. So is this
okay?
Is this an actual? Is this like a prank they're doing, or is this I'm not even sure if I want to know the answer, but I mean,
according to Chris Brunette, who is I think that's how you pronounce his name, Manhattan Institute whistleblower who left the Manhattan Institute and is now obsessed with this. It is real, and I can't really speak to that, but it's taking the internet by storm. And
I think what happened was I muted the word Destiny a while ago after he was getting way too much attention. I didn't want to see his face or hear his voice anymore. So I think that's why I managed to avoid this one. But
yeah, well, actually, we're going to talk about real stuff, but that is a real thing that happened on the internets. We are going to talk about today. We haven't actually had a chance to talk about the Lebanon ceasefire because that happened. It was inked, if you can even call it a ceasefire. It was inked after our last live stream, and it flowed directly into the Aleppo offensive of the quote unquote rebel factions, which have been isolated or held in the de facto NATO protectorate of Idlib. We are going to hear from Hekmat Abuat, who is from Syria and has been a Grayzone contributor and has covered the issue from the ground, from Syria, and from the halls of power in Washington for us at the Grayzone in a moment. And then hopefully we'll have time to talk about the furor over the nominee to lead the FBI, Kash Patel, and someone you actually have interviewed, Aaron, about Russiagate. And maybe we'll have time for Ukraine, what's happening in Georgia. We'll see where it goes. On the Lebanon ceasefire, I addressed this on Jimmy Dore, on Judge Napolitano, and we put it out on our podcast that we stream on Spotify and everywhere else. But the key issue there is that once Israel was able to compel Hezbollah to de-link its involvement in the conflict from Gaza, so that its condition for ending its involvement was not contingent on a ceasefire in Gaza, then Netanyahu was able to do a ceasefire. And that's the way Netanyahu has always actually sought quick deals to stay out of conflicts. But because of the nature of his governing coalition with such extreme figures as Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, who have designs on Gaza and settling northern Gaza, Netanyahu is more reluctant to end the Gaza conflict because his coalition would collapse. So he was able to do a ceasefire deal in Lebanon with U.S. pressure. The Israeli-born Amos Hochstein was pushing the Lebanese government, and specifically Parliamentary Speaker Nabi Berri, who is the liaison to Hezbollah, to effectively allow Israel to continue operating in southern Lebanon after a ceasefire deal. So it's not really a ceasefire. And now, since the ceasefire deal has been inked, in just like a week, UNIFIL, the United Nations peacekeeping force in southern Lebanon, has recorded, even CNN's reporting it, approximately 100 ceasefire violations by Israel. These violations are serious. UNIFIL records like the most ticky-tack violations by the Lebanese side. It could be like shepherds moving their flock. But what Israel's doing is shelling civilian areas with tanks, attacking people, abducting people, and bombing. So they're continuing to operate. Lebanon's sovereignty has been completely violated. The 2006 UN ceasefire deal has been abrogated, and Hezbollah has been actually forced to strike back, but waited for UNIFIL to make this declaration before they did so, which was very tactical. So I think this will collapse pretty soon. What are your thoughts, Aaron?
Yeah, everything is premised on Israel insisting on its right to deny the self-determination of the Palestinian people. I mean, that's why there's a conflict to begin with. That's why Hezbollah is involved to begin with. That's why there is an axis of resistance. It's because there are people in the region who want to support Palestine's right to exist and the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, which Israel is devoted to crushing. And so any agreement that is premised on that, in which Israel retains the right to deny Palestinians their freedom and continue to carry out violence, it will ensure future conflict, because eventually, even if Hezbollah adheres strictly to the terms of any ceasefire agreement with Israel, Israel will always be looking for an excuse to provoke more violence, which it then uses to deepen its occupation of Palestinians. Now its main goal is to basically take over more parts of the West Bank that it wants, if not full-blown annexation. And if it does that, there will always be resistance and there'll always be conflict. And it's a given. If you look at Israel's history, they always, even when they accept ceasefire agreements, they break them when they want to. I mean, look how many times they've broken ceasefires with Hamas in Gaza, including on the day when Barack Obama was elected in 2008, which was a really historical event. The first black president defeating, after 8 years of George W. Bush defeating the Republicans. And Israel took advantage of that and broke a ceasefire that was holding with Hamas and launched a massacre that continued up until Obama's inauguration. So it was easy to predict that Israel would continue to violate an agreement that's called a ceasefire, especially when it had, as you talked about, Amos Hochstein acting as its lawyer under the guise of being a broker.
And Donald Trump coming into power with his MEGA, or Make Israel Great Again administration, which will now feature Charles Kushner, longtime patron of Benjamin Netanyahu and father of Jared Kushner, as ambassador to France.
You know, you've been saying, you know, MEGA in jest, but Donald Trump actually recently said it out loud. I don't know where this was, but this was him speaking recently. Here he is.
Again, and we're going to make America great again. We're going to make them both great again, greater than ever before.
So there it is. You know, MEGA is not just something, a term that can be used in jest to mock, you know, MAGA. It's literally Donald Trump's credo as well. I mean, he's open about it. And that's what $100 million from Marian Adelson, along with other anti-Palestinian donors, will buy you.
He's also appointed the father of Tiffany Trump's husband, his daughter's husband, from the Boulos family in Lebanon, as a kind of Middle East peace envoy. This is a figure who ran for a parliamentary seat once in Lebanon. So but I don't think that, I think the preponderance of power in the Trump administration is firmly on the side of Miriam Adelson. In southern Lebanon, meanwhile, residents are, I mean, this is, Reuters is reporting that Israeli tanks are on the ground and residents are unable to return to their homes. Israel is basically blocking a triumphant return for the heavily Shia population of the South. And this flowed directly into the Salafi jihadi assault on Aleppo. It provided the perfect opportunity. This was a nice find by Partisan Girl, Mariam Susli, who notes that Syrian insurgent leader in Turkey, who thinks al-Qaeda will give him power, says the Hezbollah ceasefire in Lebanon was their cue to invade Syria, as it provided him with a fig leaf. He goes on to say they took advantage of the fact Israel had weakened Hezbollah, Iran, and Syria, and decided to attack, even if it means damaging Gaza during the genocide. This is why the ceasefire that did not hold was a mistake. This is her argument. It gave Israel's allies in the region an excuse to claim the Axis abandoned Palestine. It's time for the Axis to recognize this is the existential war, and there's no way out but through. And she argues that Russia must also recognize how intertwined Syria's fate is with Lebanon and Palestine. Israel's their problem too. Russia has the naval base at Tartus and the Hmeimim air base. Tartus is extremely important for Russia and its power projection, as is Syria, its only true ally in the Arab League. Syrian opposition leader says Lebanon truce open door to Aleppo assault. I mean, it was completely obvious, almost the day after the ceasefire, that this quote unquote rebel offensive began. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, and some people might say, well, if this really was related, then why didn't al-Qaeda, aka HTS, launch this offensive, you know, while the fighting was going on? And I don't know, this is just guessing, but I think the answer there is that that'd be just too obvious, right? If you're like, if you're al-Qaeda and you're attacking the Syrian government, Hezbollah and their allies, while Israel is carpet bombing Lebanon during, you know, declared hostilities, I think it's too obvious. So why not wait until after Hezbollah has been battered to do exactly what you've always wanted to do? And everyone says that that al-Qaeda has taken advantage of Israel's conflict with Hezbollah, and not to mention, but not just the, you know, the recent flare up, but years of Israeli bombings of Syria. Israel's bombed Syria hundreds of times. Yeah. On top of the fact that you have sanctions on Syria that have made, you know, have crushed the economy and have left Syria with very little resources and have devalued the value of its currency so that it's hard to pay your own fighters. Everything contributes to the climate in which al-Qaeda, and that's what they are. They've changed their name many times, but they're still al-Qaeda. They're led by the founding leader of al-Qaeda in Syria. It's also the former deputy to the founding caliph of ISIS. That's what led them to take advantage of the situation. And I think just doing it while the fighting was ongoing in Lebanon would have just been a little bit too obvious.
Yeah. But, Hezbollah fighters who might have held off the advance around Aleppo were fighting in Lebanon. And so the assault on Aleppo took place. It was like a lightning assault and has captured the entire city of Aleppo. The Idlib-based forces led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the rebranded version of al-Qaeda, led by Mohammed Jolani, who, as you mentioned, was involved at the dawn of ISIS back in Raqqa in 2012, are storming forward into the Hama countryside. And here's what that assault looked like on the day it began as they pushed to the Aleppo citadel.
تلاشوا كالغثاء وملكنا ظهرهم هل ترى منهم بقاء وغدت أجسادهم جيفة بعد رقاء آثرا من بعد عين حل بينهم البلاء وعلت صيحاتنا كبرت دون السماء نحن جند الله منا نسعدهم البعض.
Look like some real Democratic allies there, the kind of people that Bill Kristol and other neocons are celebrating right now. But to discuss what's happening on the ground in Syria and what's going to come next, we will turn to Hekmat Abuat, who is a Grayzone contributor, who is muted currently. So you can unmute yourself. And
hey guys.
Hopefully we get rid of that terrible echo that we have on your end. Maybe you have a pair of headphones. Yeah, that's not good. It sounded like he was in a...
How about now? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Much better. Much better.
Yeah.
I blame Turkish intelligence for that echo.
For sure. And maybe some in Washington as well.
Tell our audience a little about yourself, Hekmat.
Yeah, so as you said, I contributed for the Grayzone in the past, and I do investigative journalism. I'm Syrian American myself. I grew up in Aleppo until 2015 and moved to the States during the siege of Aleppo. And I've been in the belly of the beast, seeing how the operation is going. One of my latest reports for the Grayzone was about how the Syria regime change lobby operates in Washington. And essentially, if anyone wants to read that article again, it's there. It's on the Grayzone, and you can see that they succeeded. They succeeded, at least in Aleppo, maybe in Hama in the near future. But they had, they overwhelmed defenses in Syria. Syria has been weakened, as you mentioned, Aaron, by the cruel and harsh sanctions regime that has been imposed on the country since 2019 under the Caesar Act, under the Trump administration. So, just quick synopsis, and then maybe Max, you can go into your questions. But the quick synopsis here is, a lot of people are saying that maybe this was a deal. This was a deal where Aleppo was sold for some concessions elsewhere. I really don't think so. I think it's a matter of Erdogan being rejected, his offers being rejected in the last 6 months when he tried to negotiate with Assad. Assad wanted to clear all of the Turkish forces in the northern parts of Syria. Erdogan refused, and he wanted to have a negotiation. Assad refused. And what I think happened is Erdogan wanted to mobilize his HTS-backed SNA, his Turkish-backed troops in Idlib as a warning sign, but then that warning sign proved enough to overwhelm defenses that were meager and weak and weakened by, almost half a decade now of the cruelest economic sanctions campaign against a country that has most of its borders blocked by U.S. installments, military installments. Its neighbors are Lebanon and Iraq. Their economies are not doing well. Has been subjected to, I don't know, like 100 strikes by Israel a year or more. And it had its allies essentially vanquished. Hassan Nasrallah was killed. Hezbollah was weakened. Russia is preoccupied in Ukraine as it fights off all of NATO. And Iran has been threatened directly, has its own territory hit a couple of times now. So the escalation against Iran has scared Pezeshkian. Pezeshkian doesn't seem to be as engaged, as able or as willing to wage this war that is existential for Iran. I don't think he realizes that. I think he lives in a dream world where he thinks he can negotiate with the West and he can find a way to step off from the pedestal as the new enemy of the West, but he doesn't realize that that's not something he controls. And Syria is weakened. Syria was already the weakest link in the axis of resistance, and now it has been weakened more.
So why didn't we see more resistance around Aleppo from the government militias, for example, government-aligned militias? And why haven't we seen more of Bashar al-Assad? He was sort of MIA for at least 24 to 48 hours, fueling rumors that he had fled to Moscow. I think he was summoned to Moscow for meetings and then came back. But how do you explain the response?
I can't explain it, but there's speculation. There's speculation that Putin himself also wanted to put some pressure on Assad to force him into the negotiations with Turkey, and that was evident. One point of proof for that theory is that the Russian military didn't mobilize. The Hmeimim base didn't activate its Sukhois, didn't activate anything up until late, up until parts of Western Aleppo were already taken. And then they went into frantic mode and they started bombing anything that was moving. But while the truckloads of jihadis, of HES members were just essentially perusing in, the Russian Sukhois were not in our airspace. They were not in Aleppo airspace. So maybe that is one reason why Assad was not very involved, not very vocal. Yeah, but I don't give credence to the theory that he sold Aleppo. I don't think so.
And what was taking place inside Idlib leading up to this? I mean, there were some protests against Jolani. He seemed to want to puff his chest out a little bit. And what is Erdogan's game here? What is the Turkish game? I mean, the AKP and Qataris have been the front line of support for these kind of Salafi and Ikhwani forces in Syria for over a decade. But why now for Turkey, especially when Erdogan is issuing so much blustery rhetoric against one of the key beneficiaries of this offensive, Israel?
Yeah, that's also one of the reasons why I think people in Damascus and Tehran and Moscow dropped their guard, because even for the outside observer like myself, I'm in their Telegram channels, and you see that they were having somewhat of a civil war. It's not necessarily hot, but a lot of members from different faction groups were in Jolani-associated jail cells in Idlib. A lot of interfighting was taking place. So that definitely led to a lot of decision makers to drop their guard, to think that Idlib doesn't really cause a threat, that maybe down the line, maybe it's not liberated, but there's a situation where it becomes its own Idlibistan. It becomes somewhat of a Kosovo situation where it's cordoned off from the rest of Syria and it becomes Turkey's problem, which a lot of people would have preferred. But what ended up happening is Jolani was able to consolidate his authority and his control over Idlib. And now even these Telegram channels that were vehemently opposed to him are trying to catch details of his wins. and trying to go back on their claims and trying to essentially fall back in line behind him.
Aaron,
Hekmat, what was it like in Aleppo the last time insurgents took control of it? The popular narrative in Western media is that, Aleppo rose up against the government during the early years of the Dirty War, and then the Syrian government, with the help of its allies, bombed the people's residence, and that's how they took it back. Obscuring some pretty key realities, including that basically parts of Aleppo were occupied by the insurgents, who were then, as I understand it, pretty brutal to live under, and also bombing the parts of the city that were not under government control back in 2016. How do you, respond to like the conventional narrative that we see about what Aleppo was like last time, and how do you think that might compare to today?
Yeah, I mean, I lived in Western Aleppo when everyone was in the Western media was weeping over Eastern Aleppo, and essentially everything they were describing was happening equally in Western Aleppo. Yes, there was a lot of indiscriminate bombing, but it was happening on both sides, and it was a war. It was a civil war. It was a bloody civil war, and so the idea that this is just an East versus West, an underdog versus the oppressor, Assad regime, simply doesn't hold true. And that is essentially why we left as a family in 2015, because the siege of Aleppo was too harsh to bear. It was the Syrian currency skyrocketed, over hyperinflation took place, food became scarce. We had a period of 40 days where we didn't have electricity. So that was essentially a siege that was in place, but our voices didn't matter. The people in the east, some of them that stayed and weren't able to leave the battlefield, their voices mattered. There's a lot of sniper attacks happening all over the city. There were a lot of kidnappings that were taking place. So yeah, that was the reality in the city in 2014 to 2016 after the ceasefire negotiations took place. And essentially that also comes into part of this conversation that's taking place on the ground in Aleppo, on social media with my friends and others. A lot of people are unsure if they want to repeat the 2012 through 2016 phase. They are not sure if Aleppo fell so easily. They know how hard it would be for the HTS members to leave. It would have to, in 2015, 2016, with every neighborhood, it took like a month and a half to liberate. So they cannot imagine the city being destroyed once more. So I don't know, like this is sentimental, but put yourself in the shoes of a random Aleppan citizen. They've been through 14 years of war, economic collapse, the earthquake in 2023, and now essentially everything that they thought they finally could take a breath of relief that they moved on is repeating.
And just to go back to what happened in Aleppo, I mean, by 2016, when Aleppo was liberated, it was actually brought back into the hands of the Syrian state, when it was being held not just by Syrian opposition forces, but by foreign opposition fighters, including Nouraddin al-Zenki, which was backed by the CIA, the Turkish-backed Arar al-Sham. Those were the Syrian forces, but you also had like the Turkestani Islamic Party, mostly based in Idlib, from Xinjiang in China. You had Chechen fighters there. You had Abdullah Muhaisini, the psychotic Saudi preacher who was sending kids from Uzbekistan and Chechnya, like kids, like 15-year-olds, to carry out suicide bombings on Syrian Arab army positions outside of Aleppo. And they were basically just 40,000 of the Salafi jihadi factions and their family members in 5 districts in East Aleppo. And once Turkey kind of pulled the plug because it wanted to consolidate its gains even further north, then after looting the factories, right? They looted the factories of East Aleppo. I've met people from there who's lost their entire business because they were literally packed up and shipped to Turkey and stolen by Turkish MIT. After all that, the these quote unquote rebels who are portrayed as freedom fighters in US media through a coordinated media campaign run out of Turkey's Gaziantep, run out of Doha, Qatar, backed by NATO and the United States government. Once they were isolated there, Russia had already intervened and participated using its air power along with the Syrian Arab army. And it took a lot to get them out. And this was after years and years of siege, which left the old city destroyed. I think the citadel was heavily damaged. And many people were turned to refugees. And having been to Ghouta and seen the wreckage there, I mean, this is what happened when you had Jaish al-Islam from the Saudi-backed Salafi group, which tried to establish a mini Saudi Arabia, imposing Sharia law right outside Damascus's old city, and the Al-Rahman Brigade, backed by Qatar, which were actually fighting each other, and then the Syrian Arab army trying to dislodge them with Vietnam-era weapons. You had destruction, and the civilians had to get out through carefully negotiated civilian corridors. Factories were destroyed deliberately by the quote-unquote rebels, and so now it has to start all over again. And I don't know if the population, including all these young men who grew up during the dirty war who are now being conscripted, want to go in and do this whole process all over again, which would lead to destruction inside Aleppo. What do you think?
Yeah, again, the sentiment right now is open humanitarian corridors for people to leave, but also do not bomb the city. We don't want a repeat of 2012, 2016. This is also being played upon by the opposition groups because, of course, they don't want the city to be bombed. They don't want the counteroffensive to take place. But to your point, yeah, right now in Aleppo, the city that I grew up in, the city that the Christian community today is Saint Barbara feast, which is our Halloween in Aleppo, and people would be walking around the Christian communities dressed in different costumes. And yes, we did the same thing that you Westerners did. We would dress slutty if we wanted to, the woman at least. And that's no longer a possibility. I know it's naive to say that this is not the most important thing, but right now on the streets of Aleppo, there's Uzbekis, there's Turkmenis, there's people from Xinjiang who just do not fit with the mold of the Syrian community and society that used to exist there. And that community no longer exists.
There's videos of them. There's videos of them from Aleppo, and they're talking about, their complaints about the Syrian government, but they're not even speaking Arabic.
Yeah, they're not speaking Arabic.
Here's a Pakistani Dr. Shujal Islam, who actually was a key source for Bellingcat on a lot of propaganda. He's from Pakistan and the UK, and he went out on the green buses to Idlib. I guess he can't go back to the UK because he'll be arrested because he's involved with Al Qaeda. This is the post. More and more Sunni towns are being freed from the oppressive Assad regime by a Pakistani guy from the UK. You also have, again, the Turkestan Islamic Party of the Uyghurs from Xinjiang, who were all given Turkish passports under the watch of Turkish intelligence and sent to Idlib, where they took over Christian homes of Christians who were sent at gunpoint out of Idlib and given their property. They use child soldiers who've grown up now, and they are quote unquote liberating Aleppo. People from China.
Yeah, people from China, people from Uzbekistan. And you have to ask yourself, right now they're waging such a propaganda campaign, essentially doing pop interviews with people on the streets in the Christian communities, putting a mic to their face and saying like, hey, do you feel safe? Do you feel safe? Please give us a couple words. And of course, what are you going to say to them when they show up in their beards and they're asking you if you as a Christian woman feel safe after they gave you some bread? But you have to just ask yourself, what's the situation for the Christian community in Idlib? It doesn't exist. What's the situation for the Sharia teachings in Idlib? I sent you a link, Max, if you want to open it. But the signs in Idlib say it all. The signs in Idlib read the following. Al-ikhtilat haram. So essentially intermixing between the sexes is haram. Shia are the enemies of Islam. Prayer is the only way to peace. My Muslim sister, without a woman without covering, without head covering, is a city without its gates. Smoking and shisha is haram. So, I mean, this is what they are. This is who they are, and yes, they
And
have
and
their
and
caliphate.
Shia are infidels and Rafidi. They're like
Yeah, and that's the point I
blasphemers.
was
There's
getting to,
signs
Max.
all over Idlib that say that.
That's the point I was getting to. Right now, they're being very polite for Western audiences with the Christians, but they're not even trying with the Shias and the Alawites. There are videos of them going into hospitals and slapping on the soldiers and asking them literally, like, what sect are you? And some people would say Alawite, some people would say Shia and Sunni. So they're not even trying, and they desecrated Husseini sites in Aleppo already. So we just hope from the Christian community, there's this hope that the Western attention that community has will protect it. But unfortunately, I don't think it will. And sooner than later, the 300,000 community that used to be in Aleppo while I was there has now diminished to something like 50,000. And that 50,000, I predict, if this control pertains of HCS, it will drop down to mere thousands very soon.
Just a few headlines here from Western outlets. Okay, so this is from the BBC in 2015, right after Nusra, aka Al Qaeda, under the leadership of their current leader Jilani, took over Idlib. They massacred Druze villagers in Idlib. Okay, that was 2015. Then you have a few years later, the New York Times in 2022, so a few years ago, reported this. Now there was no one left, the lament of one of the last Christians in a Syrian city. And the Times reported that basically after Nusra, Al-Qaeda, HTS took over Idlib in 2015, the remaining 1,200 or so Christians fled Idlib. And by 2022, there were just 3 Christians left in Idlib. And we're supposed to now believe that these same people who massacred Druze, who forced Christians to flee, that because they changed their name for like the 3rd time to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, but still being led by the same guy, the founding leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria, that somehow they're different and things will be different for the people of Aleppo. And yes, of course, initially, after taking over the city, of course, there's going to be a propaganda effort to pretend as if, now all of a sudden we respect minorities. But this is the same group, the same leader that committed these atrocities against minorities. There's absolutely no reason to believe this spin and to believe that they're different just because they changed their name.
And with all that,
here is some footage of the Turkish Syrian National Army, the Turkish National Army, of all of the refuse of the quote unquote rebels that were regurgitated back onto Syria by Turkey. 21 of the 28 factions, by the way, had been armed by the Pentagon and CIA. Here's what they're doing to Kurds. I like how the guy with the press vest is kicking the Kurdish captive in the head.
Where's Hillary Clinton? I thought she cared about the Kurds.
Where's Bernard Henri Lévy with his lifts so he can pose for selfies with the Kurds? He's always cheered on these complete goons.
Just to add on to that, with all the propaganda effort that is currently undergoing their operations, HCS in Aleppo, there's still a lot of incidents that are falling through the cracks. I'm sure you saw the tree that is being felled, but that's not the worst of it. A lot of our friends in Aleppo in the Christian community are reporting being told, like women being told, cover your face or don't go out without your man, and Sattari Yamara, essentially like cover yourself. So, I mean, this is week 1, and with all of the propaganda.
I've gotten this from sources too, from a source at a hospital in Aleppo saying that they have been instructed, all the doctors and staff have been instructed to stay inside, not to leave the hospital. There's curfews being extended, and near the Aleppo airport at the Nairab camp, all residents have been told they need to dress Sharia style. They need to and I mean, it's just clear what happened in all the areas that the so-called rebels controlled. They established the same type of regime that the Islamic State did. And they worked alongside the Islamic State. The FSA and ISIS worked together on many operations and patted each other on the back, especially in northeastern Syria. This is all pretty well known. I actually, I'll post some video of it later. The two top State Department assets, including the director of the Syrian Emergency Task Force, were sent into Syria to find like Democrats to set up democratic courts. And they met with Ahrar al-Sham and came back and declared on camera, there are no Democrats here. What we see is that if the country is ceded to the opposition, it will be one giant Islamic state. And they openly said it in this film Red Lines, which documented the State Department assets running around Syria. And then they went ahead and said and lobbied on Capitol Hill for transferring weapons to these factions anyway. Syria is a pluralistic society. I've been there. It's a society where Sunni and Shia and Christians have coexisted for a very long time. And that won't happen if these forces take over. They can speak all the pretty talk they want, but we've seen what they've done before. And there's just no way past that. And the US is supporting it. The whole collective West is supporting it. I don't know how do your, I want to talk about the geopolitical component too, but how do your, do you have family in Aleppo now or friends now? And what are they saying?
Yeah, they're all just horrified. I mean, it's all been a whirlwind for them. They've panicked a lot and they're unsure what to do. A lot of them tried to leave, were sent back. As of now, it's not quite clear yet, but there is a sense that they're being used as human shields. And they're really trying to keep the civilians in the city so that a bombing campaign doesn't take place. So yeah, a lot of people freaking out. But to add to your point, even that with that silly video of an HDS fat jihadi felling a tree in the middle of the Christian community.
Yeah, I think it's an old video, so I don't want to.
It's not an old video. No.
Okay.
See, they even got to you, and you're an investigative journalist. You're the best in the
All right, I just
field. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, it's not a fake video, but they launched such a strong.
I didn't say fake. I said old, but
old. Yeah, it's not an old video. It was posted on their own Telegram channels, and it has the sources. And I posted the sources, and then people tried to lie about it, and then eventually themselves, the people who felled it, apologized. They said regarding this tree, one of our members made a mistake and felled it. But we corrected the tree. We fixed the tree. This country is for everyone. So they essentially worked on the propaganda and they refixed the tree. But the propaganda campaign on a single tree was so strong to convince the West that these people are not jihadis. They're not Islamists. They're there for a pluralistic society in Aleppo and Syria. To the extent that they even convince you that this is a fake video. Here, I'll send you the correction where they themselves posted about it. But yeah, immediately once I posted this video from their own Telegram channels, Max, they immediately bombarded me with accusations that this is an old video. NATO trolls came into my replies, started attacking me, accusing me of spreading lies. People from the Hudson Institute and the Atlantic Institute started accusing me of spreading propaganda to be an Assadist, to be a Mhabbak guy for Assad, even though open the tweet that I just sent you.
Yeah, I got it.
They literally apologized about the tree. So as simple as a fake tree being felled, the propaganda machines in the West are
it's promising, according to Rami Jarrah.
Yeah, of course it is. Of course it is promising to him.
This guy used to be like at Amnesty International or this is like one of the NGO regime
the West,
so
West
promising
regime change puppets were all activated for this one. I mean, Aleppo alone, Syria alone cannot withstand NATO and all of the West and Islamist movements targeting us. So maybe China should have intervened when they started hearing about the Uyghurs coming over. Maybe they should have shored up the Syrian economy to help us withstand the sanctions, because they were the only player that was left on the table that could have done anything about this. And they're just, the Beijing dragon seems to be just fast asleep.
On that note, Hekmat, when I went to Syria in June 2021, there was a lot of hope that China was going to basically bail out Syria from the weight of the sanctions. They were going to come in with reconstruction projects. China hasn't delivered at all. Now, of course, primary responsibility lies with the U.S., which has imposed these murderous sanctions, which are explicitly designed to impoverish Syrians, to prevent reconstruction. Andrew Tabler, who was a senior official in the State Department under Trump, who was responsible for Syria policy, he bragged in Foreign Affairs magazine that U.S. sanctions have exacerbated fuel and food shortages for Syrian civilians. That's basically a direct quote. Exacerbated food shortages.
We'll show you one of the key cheerleaders for the Aleppo offensive, the quote unquote liberation, Andrew Tabler, who's featured on CNN often now. Here he is, celebrating what appears to be one of his favorite countries.
So this is the guy who, unfortunately, people who claim to care about Syria have sided with, is people like this. Someone who, is there with the Israeli flag and who brags about increasing food shortages for Syrian civilians, depriving Syrian civilians of food. That's the people who the so-called rebels in Syria are supported by. But my question
well, none of this would have been possible. This offensive, the collapse of the front lines, none of it would have been possible without the Caesar sanctions, without the starvation and impoverishment of the Syrian public, the demoralization of the Syrian public. It was denied the post-war recovery that most countries enjoy by these disgusting sanctions. And none of those who are cheering on this quote unquote liberation had any problem or anything to say about sanctions, a literal act of war targeting the entire Syrian public, just as they never have anything to say about hundreds of Israeli attacks on Syria every year. I think a lot of them kind of quietly celebrate, and some of them loudly celebrated the killing of Hassan Nasrallah.
Yes, they did. And they mocked Lebanese victims of the pager attacks recently. There's some examples of that. But my question, so obviously the primary responsibility is with the U.S. and everybody else involved in the dirty war and the sanctions, the military occupation, which deprives Syria of its oil and wheat. And we've covered all this extensively. But my question is, what about frustration with the government? Because as I was saying, so there was this expectation that China was going to bail out Syria. That didn't happen. And what I heard from people I know in Syria when I was there and since is that there's a sense that the government is not recognizing the suffering of the people, that there's sort of been this attempt to sweep everything under the rug and deny that people are really suffering, and just not really confront the fact that the currency is devalued, food prices are sky high, food is not really available, fuel, like to get fuel, people have to line up in these very long queues. It's a very arduous process, and the feeling was the government, even for people who recognize the dirty war and all the horrible things that the U.S. did, the government is just not really willing to recognize reality. It's trying to deny things. What's your sense of that?
So just quickly to add on that, Aleppo has not lost electricity since the quote-unquote liberation. So for the first time in 14 years, my friends and family in Aleppo have had 24/7 electricity. So that is also being used as part of a bargaining chip, essentially saying like, okay, maybe you live under Sharia law now, maybe you eventually become a part of the southern provinces of Turkey, the Neo-Ottoman Empire. But at the very least, look at that. You're no longer going to be suffering from economic sanctions.
But wait a second. But wait. Why is there energy now all of a sudden? Is that because al-Nusra and al-Qaeda are like electrical geniuses who somehow figured a way to give people of Aleppo power? Or, I mean, as Kevork said, he said that the reason is because the factories in Aleppo that take up so much power have shut down because people are fleeing, because they're concerned about once again having their factories looted and destroyed, as what happened last time the insurgents took over Aleppo. So that's why there's now more power available to the people of Aleppo. That's what he said.
Either way, people who live in Aleppo who don't mind living under a form of Sharia Islam will be going through an economic resurgence. They will, as of now, the European Union sanctions that were imposed on the northern cities like Aleppo have been removed because now they no longer fall under the auspices or the control of the Syrian regime. So the sanctions will be removed from any areas that are not under the control of the government. And opposition propagandists are already going out and making videos and essentially promising the Aleppo communities that they're going to have their lives turned upside down. They're going to have economic booms that they've never imagined. Aleppo is going to be the new Hong Kong, the new Singapore. Sure, they can make these promises because they can back them up. They can say, okay, most of the sanctions are going to be removed. You're going to be able to have an economic life again. But to answer your question about specifically the faults and the blame on the Syrian government, yes, of course, the Syrian government has been depleted. The Syrian government is rabidly corrupt, of course. There's no denying that. But also, you got to ask yourself this question: with such a calculated campaign against the Syrian government, the country of Syria in the last 15 years, but really in the last 70 years since the creation of Israel, you cannot maintain control of a country without having a consolidated grip on power, without having a close-knit group of people that you trust, that are essentially your proxies within government, that are your cronies. It breeds this situation, the geopolitical situation that Syria has been in for the last 70 years only breeds corruption. Because otherwise, what happens in Egypt happens in Syria. What happened in Libya happens in Syria quite easily. We just become another puppet state that has been controlled by the West for the last, I don't know how many decades, like Jordan. The problem Syria has faced for the last 7 decades is that we have opposed the Western neo-colonial program in the region. We opposed Israel, we opposed Turkish expansionism, and we opposed the Saudi monarch, the monarchs, the Gulf monarchs, who all acquiesced to the Western plan in the region. That was our fault. That was the fight we chose to wage as a country, and we've obviously are failing.
Yeah, and one of his.
But that wasn't my question, though. My question was, like, the impression that I, again, from people that I know, that the government was not being just recognizing the suffering of the people.
Well, what does it mean to recognize? I mean,
just
they can't do anything about it.
You are seen and you are heard. Like the currency's been
they don't have bread
by Caesar sanctions.
to give. They don't have fuel to give. Why? I mean, yes, they are trying to keep the nepotistic lines, the links alive by giving them more from the tiny, minute pie of the Syrian economy that they can to keep them loyal. But that's what they have to do to maintain their hold on power. And yes, that looks like corruption. It is corruption. And a lot of people who are tired from living under such suffocating economic sanctions will blame the government. And that is a clear use and success of sanctions.
It does go back, as you said, Hekmat, to Syria's role as a post-colonial bulwark against Israeli expansionism and Western empire. 1967, Syria came under attack by Israel. In 1973, Syria tried to recover the Golan Heights, the occupied Golan Heights, and was sold out by Sadat, and was then refused to participate in the normalization with Israel that Sadat did, and refused to join the other Arab states that were going to cave in to Israel in the West with all kinds of economic enticements, which have not benefited Egypt, which have distorted Egypt's economy as well. In Paris, normalization was constantly put out there. It rejected the Oslo Accords. It didn't come in for normalization like Jordan. After Iraq was the next target on the regime change checklist of Western neocons who were guided by Israel. In the mid 2000s, John Kerry and Nancy Pelosi went to Damascus to try to convince Bashar al-Assad to break off relations with Iran in order to have all kinds of enticements, like, for example, setting up the Louvre Museum, art museum in Damascus, and getting favorable loans from the IMF. One thing the Assad family would never do was break off relations with Iran. And this is what helped Hezbollah deal a bloody nose to Israel in 2006, because its only supply line was through Syria. And anyone who's cheering this on wants to see the shattering of the resistance axis, which is really the only material force left capable of pressuring Israel, pressuring greater Israel. It's going straight through Syria. And the goal here appears to be, after Aleppo, cut off the M5 highway and then move into the Alawite heartland, where there was horrific atrocities, slaughter in villages in 2013 and 2014 when the FSA and Al-Qaeda aligned forces penetrated there. But to then move south and completely cut off the supply line to Lebanon, which would be Israel's wet dream. Israel would orgasm. And it's why Israel supported these very same forces in the Syrian side of the Golan. IDF chief finally acknowledges that Israel supplied weapons to Syrian rebels. Finally, thank you, outgoing Army Commander Gadi Eisenkot. Inside Israel's secret program to back Syrian rebels, this was by the Israeli researcher Elizabeth Surkov, who is now a hostage or captive in Iraq, where she was secretly conducting some kind of intelligence operation. Fighters were armed and paid to keep Iranian-linked forces, in other words, forces that were invited by the UN-recognized Syrian government away from Israel's border. We have no beef with Israel, Syrian Islamist rebel group claims. That's the Yarmouk Martyrs Brigade. We always heard about Yarmouk. We never heard about the Islamist groups that had penetrated deep inside, refusing to leave, attacking Palestinians inside, and declaring they had no beef with Israel. Exclusive, Israel is tending to wounded Syrian rebels. Syrian fighters, including Salafi jihadi fighters, were taken to Israeli hospitals through the occupied Golan Heights for treatment, then sent back into the field. And we also know that the Syrian White Helmets were evacuated with the help of the Israeli Shin Bet through Jordan into the occupied Golan Heights and then sent abroad. Israeli former Defense Secretary Moshe Ya'alon said, if I'm presented with a choice between having ISIS in the Syrian Golan or the Syrian government or Assad, I will choose ISIS. So those are the stakes. I don't know what you or Aaron want to add there, but those are the stakes, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I foresee a future where they continue south, they take Hamad, they take Homs, and then there's a cordoning that takes place, and Syria is divided further. And the dream is, I think the wet dream that you referred to, Max, is you have an Alawite statelet that's no longer connected to the fight, that Israel eventually treats as an ally in the alliance of minorities against the Sunnis of the region, which is their plan. Because even now you're seeing them shedding crocodile tears over the Kurds that are being massacred in Aleppo and in Sheikh Maqsoud.
Yeah.
So that is their dream. They're using this currently Sunni Wahhabist Salafist version of Islam that is rampaging through the region as a mechanized bull that is tearing through the minorities of the region until they can mobilize it enough to get rid of the opposition and then retarget it as the only standing opposition to the Israeli expansionist program in the region. So yeah, the future does not look bright in any sense of the word.
Well, what is what's next? I mean, we saw the Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi in Damascus. There's celebratory. There's a lot of celebration I see on social media about the Idlib forces' offensive around Hama, claiming that Hama will fall at any minute. If that takes place, that would be disastrous, I think, for Damascus. What do you see happening next?
Yeah, it's funny. It's finally coming back to Hama. It all started there in the 70s and 80s in Syria. That was the original uprising that tainted the name of Hafiz al-Assad.
Yeah.
You gotta ask yourself, where did that original uprising come from? It came from the Constitution, our first constitution as a country that was written down.
Right.
The only problem that it had is that it didn't have a statement stating that the president of Syria needs to be a Muslim. And that started driving Muslim Brotherhood types in Syria and Hama to rise against what they perceived as a minority-led government that is oppressing Sunnis.
It also contained provisions protecting women's rights.
Yeah, it also did that, allowing them to go to schools, allowing them to exist like human beings. And that fundamentalist idea of Islam has been weaponized, and that's the story of the Middle East, of the modern Middle East. Weaponized Sunni fundamentalism to destroy other minorities in and around the expansionist Zionist state.
And so I mean, to my question, are these reports correct of the offensive continuing successfully into the Hama countryside?
I don't know if successfully, but they are continuing, and they're close to the city. And as of now, they're shoring up the defense lines of the Syrian army with their supporters. But you're also noticing a lot of weaknesses in the axis of resistance. The Iraqi Hasht, the militias, have been standing on the border for the last 5 days, announcing, we're coming in now, we're just about to cross the border in and help. And they're not coming in because they know this, the minute they step in, they would be wiped off the map by Israel, Turkey, or both. So there's unprecedented weakness, military weakness, propaganda weakness in the axis of resistance. And again, partially because of the preoccupation of Russia, partially because of the weakness of Hezbollah, and of course, partially because Pezeshkian, again, doesn't seem like he wants this. It doesn't seem like he wants this fight. I don't know, you talked to him or talked to his team in the around the UNGA recently, but he doesn't seem like he's committed.
No, I mean, he was there to try to get a deal back on track with the U.S. and the West and to have as many meetings as possible. He was trying to prevent a regional war that seemed to be impossible to elude and probably existential for the resistance axis.
And the one thing I'll add is that this is such a tenuous time in this transition period between the Trump and Biden administration. Because Trump, we got to remember, with all his faults, did try to leave Syria. So maybe all of these movements are taking place just before he comes in, just before, like a last push that turned out very successful, that Langley are trying to push through, and they've succeeded. So it's a very clear time frame, in my understanding, during this transition phase, that they're trying to hand Trump a win that he can easily brag about, and they could convince him that, look, we made great progress on the ground. You have excuses and you have support when you say, okay, you know what, we're going to keep some troops on the ground in Syria.
Trump seemed to understand the reality in Syria. He said before that U.S. weapons ended up in the hands of Al-Qaeda, and he shut down formally the CIA program that armed the groups that were fighting alongside Al-Qaeda.
That was back before he understood that aligns with the Zionist plan.
Well, yeah, but then when he tried to withdraw, when he ordered the withdrawal of U.S. troops, he was basically ignored by his own generals, and he went along with them. And then he said, "Yeah, we're actually going to stay, and we're going to take the oil." So he became on board with the very agenda that he claimed to oppose. And then he also signed into law the Caesar sanctions that have, further impoverished the people of Syria and made the country a lot weaker. So he's done a lot to set the stage for this insurgent takeover by crushing the Syrian economy and by, supporting Israel as it carried out hundreds of airstrikes and also bombing Syria himself at least twice over now debunked allegations of chemical weapons use by the Syrian government. So, and I expect Trump, given who he surrounded himself with, even though he does have Tulsi Gabbard as the nominee for Director of National Intelligence, who has been critical of the dirty war, but with the exception of her, everyone is on board with this agenda of, weakening Syria and waging a dirty war, and that's what I expect from him. But on the other hand, how many forces do the insurgents, like does Al Qaeda really have, and the allied Turkish militias, and is it enough to sustain a battle with not just the Syrian government but also Hezbollah and Russia if they do come in? I'm not so pessimistic on the chances of the Syrian government and their allies retaking territory, because they've already invested a lot in Syria. And are they really going to now, after a decade-long war, accept defeat where Syria becomes even more of a rump state? I somehow don't think so. But I guess we'll see.
Yeah, I'm not as optimistic. I think there are reports that there are not loads of them. I'm hearing reports of 40K, something like that, of HTS members in and around the liberated zones of Aleppo. But at the same time, Hezbollah can't mobilize. Russia is almost broke. Iran is trying to pull back. I don't know who's going to help us, the Houthis. So, there's not a clear way out.
I don't know if Russia's broke. Certainly Russia is stretched thin, and someone like Jake Sullivan is bragging. He was on CNN the other day, and he said, "This is a result of Syria's allies being in a weaker strategic position." In other words, Jake Sullivan was saying that the fact that the U.S. has been fueling all these conflicts elsewhere in Ukraine, in Lebanon, that has undermined Syria's allies. So he was basically taking credit in part for the advances of Al Qaeda. Yes, but to say Russia's broke and they're not in a position to intervene, look, maybe you're right. We'll see. But I just, again, it's just my hunch. I somehow doubt, after all that time and effort being put into preventing regime change in Syria, that somehow everyone's going to walk away. But
it seemed like they did in the last 5 days, that they just simply pulled back. And again, liberating an area is going to take, I think, years. Again, Aleppo is going to go through the same grueling war that they went through. Maybe we should be hopeful, but I don't see a way out that is clear as of now. And the last point on Trump, another promising sign that might have panicked people in Langley and made them push for this last offensive that turned out successful is his pronouncements about sanctions and how they've been overused. He was at an economic club of New York City, and he made statements stating essentially that we've overused sanctions, they've weakened the dollar, and we should start lessening sanctions, removing them, and not rely on them as much as we've done in the past. So maybe they felt threatened that the last useful tool that they had against Syria is going to be potentially weakened, and maybe now is a time to sick Turkey. Turkey in turn sicks its jihadis against Aleppo, and they try this last offensive.
Well, we're going to keep following the situation as it develops, and we'll have you back. I don't think this is going to be far from the last stream we do on this. I mean, what we're looking at, I think, is much more than a regional war, and it's an existential war where Israel, the U.S., and its tools in the region are seeking an upper hand over the resistance axis and trying to prevent it from rearming, and Syria is really the key. Removing Syria will remove, like, the spinal cord of the resistance axis. So we're going to keep following this. We've been talking to Hekmat Abuat, who is from Aleppo in Syria, and is a Grayzone contributor. You're based in New York?
Yeah, New York as of now.
All right, so thanks a lot for joining us, Hekmat, and we're definitely going to have you back for more.
Thanks.
Thanks, Hekmat. Good to see you.
So yeah.
Hekmat, by the way, he mentioned this. He did a great story for the Grayzone, going undercover, basically, or on the inside as pro-regime change lobby groups were on Capitol Hill trying to lobby Congress members to impose sanctions on Syria. And it's a great window into how these people think. They don't. I mean, some of these people are Syrian, but they don't care, and actually they're gleeful about imposing sanctions that impoverish the people actually living inside the country. Everyone knows that now, what the impact of these sanctions are. The UN Special Rapporteur on sanctions has called the sanctions on Syria, illegal and inhumane. Elena Dohan, I've interviewed her before a few times here at the Grayzone. But you're seeing now but this is the playbook, and the U.S. always plays the long game. They make countries suffer enough for being outside of U.S. control, outside of the grip of U.S. Israeli hegemony, and eventually they just count on people giving up, getting exhausted. And that strategy has resulted in successes for Al Qaeda here. And so, even if the U.S. wasn't like directly involved, or wasn't aware beforehand of Al Qaeda, well, I'm sure they're aware of the plans to launch the attack. But even if they weren't directly involved, the fact that the CIA helped Al Qaeda capture Idlib in 2015, Al Qaeda would
providing them with tow missiles, when they
Yeah.
were called Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, which was the rebrand of Jabhat al-Nusra.
Yeah, I mean, all these. So they help Al Qaeda establish their only stronghold in Syria, in Idlib. They impose sanctions against the parts of the country where most Syrians live, impoverishing people. They occupy the parts of Syria that have its wheat and its oil reserves, further impoverishing Syria. And they, enable, and actually they take part in having Israel bomb Syria hundreds of times, because when Israel bombs Syria, and this reported in the Wall Street Journal, they do it with U.S. Assistance and endorsement.
Well,
So,
here's sorry to
when
interrupt.
all those things happen, you're fueling conditions that make it easy for groups like Al Qaeda to take advantage. So even if the U.S. isn't directly involved in this operation, it couldn't have happened without all these actions that the U.S. has taken over the years.
Well, the U.S. has gotten directly involved. This is an A-10 Warthog U.S. Air Force fighter bombing Syrian government and popular mobilization unit forces around Deir ez-Zor in northeastern Syria. So the U.S. has entered the conflict. It is now officially Al-Qaeda's air force, as it has been in the past. In 2017 and 2018, providing cruise missile attacks, but now it's basically providing air cover in the east. That is where the U.S. is, as Trump said, taking the oil. It's occupying the areas around the Kanoko oil fields. It was denying the Syrian government the ability to retake the territory that had been seized by ISIS as part of the ISIS caliphate. ISIS had besieged Deir ez-Zor for years, and the residents there were surviving off of airlifts. So now the U.S. is back there, and it's not just, quiet support. Although we saw HTS fighters showing up in the field with tow missiles in 2019, 2020. The U.S. was green lighting weapons into Idlib. Turkey, of course, directly supporting them. That's pretty staggering. And then, of course, we have, and I think it's so important to get someone on like Hekmat, who's from Syria, because we're constantly told to listen to Syrian voices. Listen to Syrian voices, but the only Syrian voices we're going to hear are Syrians who are part of the diaspora, who support the regime change operation, and who are effectively U.S. government assets, like from the Syrian Emergency Task Force. And then you have all of the Beltway experts, the so-called experts. There are so few actual Syria scholars in this country. One of the few ones is Joshua Landis, who's constantly demonized. But then you have all these scholars who are sponsored by the Gulf states to declare that the rebels, the so-called rebels, are just moderate rebels, and to vet them at places like the Atlantic Council and Institute for the Study of War, the little Kagan neocon shop, like Charles Lister, who is listed today by Drop Site News as just an expert, Syria expert. Charles Lister. Charles Lister was basically Al-Qaeda's de facto lobbyist in DC, regime change lobbyist, sponsored by Gulf monarchies. And, you know, these people are being repurposed without any kind of scrutiny at all. And that's how you, yeah, go ahead.
Well, if I recall right, Charles Lister is the guy who vouched for the, you know, moderate nature of that same insurgent group that ended
Noradin al-Zinki.
Yeah, that ended up beheading that young Palestinian.
They beheaded a Palestinian fighter from a refugee camp in Syria on camera.
Who was either, I mean, he looked very young. Some people say he was 12 years old. Others say he was 18, but regardless.
He was 18.
He was 18. So
they beheaded him on camera. It doesn't matter if he was, you know.
I'm just saying, I'm telling the story. It just, so they beheaded a young Palestinian of 18 years old. And this was after Charles Lister vouched for how moderate they are. And this to him was one of the vetted moderate groups that the U.S. should be supporting and arming.
But even before that, it was known that Noradin al-Zinki's founder was like a Cretan who was a known Salafi preacher who killed his own sister in an honor killing. It was known that he was a fanatic. And Lister still put them on his list, which was sent to David Cameron in the UK and sent to the US as well. And now he's still being treated as a Syria expert by Drop Site, which is supposed to be sort of an anti-establishment outlet. I mean, this is like what Lister was doing. He brought to the Middle East Institute, which is completely funded by the UAE. He brought a guy named Mustafa Sajari on January 1st. And Sajari's there in a suit, but here's Sajari in the field calling to establish an Islamic state in Syria in a Vice News production. And then they take a guy during the Vice News production around the side of this wall and execute him after capturing him. This is the guy that Charles Lister brought to Washington, D.C. to shop around as a moderate rebel. There he is. Okay, let them kill him. That's him. I mean, I could just go on and on, but the cast of characters that comprise Beltway experts on Syria are just lobbyists for war, regime change, the Gulf states, and Al-Qaeda. I mean, Lister compared Mohammed Jolani, the founder of Jabhat al-Nusra, who's now leading this offensive, to Che Guevara.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, this is a major problem on the, not just with the media but also with the pro-Palestine left. Is there's a huge division, and a lot of people, you know, in our opinion, have been duped and to go along with an agenda that undermines everything they stand for. They claim to oppose Israel, but yet inside, as we've talked about, inside Syria, they're taking essentially the side of Israel. Israel has bombed Syria hundreds of times and armed the same anti-government insurgency that is now taking territory. And it's an issue. And part of the problem is, you know, if you look at sites that have very reliable, accurate coverage of Palestine, such as Al Jazeera and Middle East Eye, when it comes to Syria, you see a very different picture. And
I wonder why.
Well, let's talk about, I mean, so Al Jazeera is funded by Qatar, obviously, and Qatar was a major funder of the insurgency. Is Middle East Eye, are they tied to Qatar as well?
Same thing.
Same thing. Okay. Yeah. So this is, and this confuses people, and it becomes very difficult to have a sober conversation about it. And also another problem is when people do dissent from the prevailing line on Syria, as we both experienced, you get viciously attacked and called names, and there's attempts to deplatform you. So it's very hard. It's hard to have a sober conversation about it.
Yeah. I would say the attacks are more vicious on Syria because you're busting so many delusions, and the attacks are coming from inside the building. Like the attacks come from like the Trotskyist left, which believes in permanent regime change. And, you know, just a lot of stupid white liberals who work at NGOs join in the attacks, along with people who are sectarian and might support Palestine, but they're sectarian on Syria, and that transcends whatever support they have for resisting Israel. It's just pretty obvious, and they have become I don't care. They're the biggest tools of Israel, useful tools, and on the ground, they are tools in a material way because they've been armed by Israel. There's no denying it. I don't know how you get around that. I don't know how you deny it, or deny that Turkey is a NATO state that is seeking to establish a NATO protectorate, cutting deeper and deeper into the last Arab state that actually supports resisting Israel in a material way, and which has been weakened by brutal sanctions. Yeah, I mean, we could do, I don't know, another 2 hours on that. We've been talking about it for years. We really started doing these live streams after the dirty war, when the dirty war was kind of in the rearview mirror. But I think, here it is. It's never going away. And the West and its assets will never stop coming for you until you just bow and bend the knee before Israel and the empire.
Yeah. The idea that the Syrian war was over has obviously been completely disproven. I mean, and after all that horror from before, it's just hard to imagine it. As Hekmat was talking about, people are tired and don't want to relive all the carnage that happened. But yet that's the reality that we might be facing. Because the alternative is that an Al-Qaeda offshoot gets control of Syria's largest city and the home to, Christians and other minorities, like a really important part of Syria's social fabric. Its former industrial heartland, until the dirty war, when, as we talked about, it was largely destroyed, and some, many of its industrial assets were stripped and sold off to Turkey. It's hard to think about all that happening all over again.
And here we are. So I think we'll have to probably cover this next week and maybe the week after that. And having followed this really closely and adjusted and sharpened my viewpoint over time, I think that we can safely assume that the PR campaign that the so-called rebels have been waging in Aleppo, claiming to protect pluralism and not abuse locals, will fade away very quickly. And all of our projections about them being tools about the West, Israel, and the most undemocratic sellout forces in the Middle East, those will prove correct too. It's just the way it is. It's the way it has been. So I don't know if you want to move on or there's anything else you want to add here.
Yeah, no, we can move on.
So should we do Kash?
Sure.
Or Hunter Biden? Something a little bit lighter.
Yeah, no, sure. Well, speaking of like reliving, old conflicts, it's like we're reliving 2016 all over again.
Yeah.
With Trump coming into office. And this time he is appointing people to his cabinet who were, a part of his team when he was pushing back against the scandal, the fake scandal that engulfed him last time he entered office, which was Russiagate, when he was framed as a Russian agent. And the person he's just appointed to head the FBI is Kash Patel, who, is a pretty interesting figure. And I've interviewed him here at the Grayzone before. He played a really critical role exposing the FBI's abuses in carrying out Russiagate and getting surveillance warrants against members of Trump's campaign and lying in the process and, concealing the fact that they were relying on the Steele dossier, which was funded by the Clinton campaign, and pretending as if they had vetted Steele as some sort of credible source when really he was just a paid operative of the Clinton campaign. So Kash Patel helped expose this when he was an investigator at the House Intelligence Committee, and because of that, he's really loathed in Washington, and there's accordingly now been a freak out about him being appointed to head the FBI. But I just see it as the direct result of Trump being framed as a Russian agent, which everybody wants to forget about in part because I think it's so embarrassing for everyone who fell for it. Like, we were one of the few sites that didn't go along with this insane mania over
one of the few lefty sites, I guess.
Lefty sites over fictional Russian interference and this idea of a sprawling conspiracy between Trump and Russia. It's a long time ago now, but this was the dominant theme, and everybody fell for it. And Kash Patel is someone who, as an investigator, helped debunk it. And so right now, him being appointed to head the FBI, the very agency that was weaponized to frame Trump as a Russian agent, that is causing alarm bells in Washington among the people who pushed the whole Russiagate scam.
Let's watch a portion of your interview with Kash Patel on the CrowdStrike dimension.
Do you know what happened there? Has there ever been any attempt to find out was there a serious attempt by the FBI to get access? And do you know who denied it? Let me set up this clip first, because as you say, it's incredibly strange. So what I'm talking about here is basically the FBI admitted under oath that they didn't conduct their own investigation of the DNC servers when Democrats and the firm they hired, CrowdStrike, claimed they were hacked by Russia. Instead, the FBI relied on the forensics of CrowdStrike, which, just like Christopher Steele, was working for Hillary Clinton as Hillary Clinton was framing Trump as a Russian agent. So I'm asking Kash Patel here about the FBI's odd reliance on a Clinton campaign contractor, CrowdStrike, rather than conducting its own forensic investigation of the DNC servers. Strange to let the purported victim, the Democratic Party, control the investigation of this most critical issue, this foundational issue of the hacking of the DNC server. I mean, this was the incident that basically kicked off Russiagate.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big deal to have one of the two largest political parties in the United States of America say they were hacked by one of our biggest opponents. You would want the US government to find that out for the American people. Didn't matter if it was a DNC that was hacked or the RNC, you would want to know that. And what James Comey did was he basically said, I am smarter than everybody else, which is what he always does, and used government speak to trample on how an investigation is normally run. Here's how you get to the details, Aaron. You subpoena the servers. You, the FBI, and the Department of Justice have full-out subpoena authority on an investigation of this magnitude when you're saying a foreign country interfered and broke into the servers of a political party in America. You can go to an Article 3 judge and get a warrant overnight for that. They refused to do that. When we asked them why they didn't do that, they didn't give us an answer. They just said what you said a little bit ago. CrowdStrike's great. We can trust them. I've never in my life, and this goes back to my public defender days, ever been able to convince the FBI that, oh, hey, by the way, what my defendant is saying, the company he used is good enough. You, the FBI, don't have to look at it. Every judge would have laughed me out of federal court. Every FBI agent, and rightfully so, would have said, we're hitting you with a subpoena if you don't want to help us investigate this actual crime. And for some reason, James Comey was able to dupe the Obama administration's DOJ and then later the Trump administration's DOJ into continuing this charade. And he has never been asked pinpoint a question and answer on that doesn't result in him saying CrowdStrike is great.
So that's one of your two interviews with FBI Director nominee Kash Patel when he was a House investigator on the Russiagate saga. And I mean, they're epic interviews. It was before he was well known. I think the second one is incredible. It starts out with him describing how he's discovered that the FISA warrant for Carter Page was actually the product of the bogus Steele dossier, which is just such a shocking national security scandal, that a dossier that was paid for by the Clinton campaign to a former MI6 agent for hire, which is just filled with lies, actually got an American citizen wiretapped by the FBI, by the Department of Justice, just showing weaponization. And now we're being told Kash Patel's going to weaponize the FBI. But really what this is sort of revenge for the weaponization of the FBI.
Yeah. And his background, he's a former public defender. I don't know if there's ever been an FBI director nominee, who's ever had that on his resume, being a public defender. And then, he is very loyal to Trump. I mean, that's no secret. So Trump certainly has an interest here in installing a loyalist. But again, this is the product. This is what happens when you're as an agency, you take part in framing a candidate turned president as a Russian agent, which is what the FBI did. There's even affidavits. There's one affidavit from an FBI agent who asked to be taken off of the Russia investigation because it was so biased and they knew there was nothing there, but they still continued it. So Kash Patel is a result of this. And he's someone who is hated in Washington, not because, he'll do Trump's bidding. People don't care about a loyalist FBI director. There have been plenty of those, but because he's actually been critical of the intelligence agencies and their role in abusing their position. And so his nomination is going to be really interesting. And we'll see, how he'll do under Senate questioning. But the awkward thing for Democrats and anybody opposed to Kash Patel is that he was right about Russiagate. David Ignatius, who's a columnist for the Washington Post, very close to intelligence officials, he even acknowledged in a column about Kash Patel that when it comes to Russiagate, Kash Patel, quote, hit pay dirt, because he did. It was such a scam, and so that like anybody who exposed it is going to be on the right side. So this is Russiagate returning, and we'll see how the people who have an interest in covering up Russiagate handle the fact that one of the people who helped expose it is being nominated to head the FBI. It's going to be pretty interesting.
Here's Kash Patel on shutting down the J. Edgar Hoover FBI headquarters.
What do you do about the FBI? What does should he do about the FBI when he gets into office? Because I got to believe these agents, many of them are dug in deep.
Look, one of my biggest personal recommendations is you shut down the FBI headquarters building and open it up the next day as the Museum of the Deep State. And you send those 7,000 agents in the headquarters building downrange to chase down rapists, to chase down murderers, to chase down drug traffickers, and let the cops be cops on the streets across America. You keep a small contingent in Washington, D.C. That's step one. You get rid of half of the legion of lawyers and special counsels that exist within the FBI to do one thing, to corrupt and obstruct government oversight from constitutionally applicable committees in Congress. And another aspect of it real quick is one of the biggest institutions in the FBI that has been troubled and politicized and weaponized has been their intel component. We have an intel agency. I don't need it to be redone within the walls of the FBI. We've shown when we've given them that power, what they do to it. They unlawfully surveil a president and his candidate. So those are three quick things that we could rattle off. That would be my recommendation to reform the FBI.
So, I mean, a lot of this is motivated by support for Trump, partisanship, but why is the FBI building even named for J. Edgar Hoover? And, who's attacking Kash Patel? It's people like Andrew McCabe. People were claiming, oh, he's going to weaponize the Bureau. Or Tom Nichols, this like liberal cartoon at the Atlantic magazine. If Donald Trump's goal is to break the FBI and turn it into an instrument of revenge, Kash Patel is the perfect nominee to run it. I mean, turn it into an instrument of revenge. The building is named after J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah.
What do you think it's about?
Yeah.
What do you think it's been doing to the American people?
Yeah.
So
yeah,
anything to weaken the bureaucratic power, the overwhelming bureaucratic power of the FBI and all of the fake investigations it carries out to justify its priorities and make its paychecks, all the politicized investigations to actually go after real criminals. I mean, it is refreshing to hear a call for that. I don't know if it will come to fruition.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with Trump and his circle. I mean, there's a lot of talk about taking on the deep state, but what did Trump actually do in office about that? Nothing. We'll see if he's learned his lesson, if anything changes this round. And the real test, I think, of all these, vows to uphold the Constitution and undermine surveillance abuses will be, not just when it serves Trump's interests. So, like, for example, going after the people who perpetrated Russiagate, which I do think is important. There needs to be accountability for it. There hasn't really been any yet. But also, like, what happens if, Trump and his allies start calling for persecuting people who support Palestinian rights, as they've talked about doing? Will Kash Patel implement that? Will the Constitution be followed then, or will free speech go out the window? I mean, that will be the real test. But on the issue of Russiagate alone, it's just a fact that the government was weaponized to undermine a presidential campaign. Their supporters were mocked as, dupes of Russia, and there hasn't been accountability for it.
And they were called conspiracy theorists when they pointed out that Trump Tower was actually wiretapped. And
they were called conspiracy theorists for basically doing anything to question the origins of the dumbest conspiracy theory of all time, which is that Trump conspired with Vladimir Putin. It was being blackmailed with the P tape. You know, yeah, like I said, it's going to be really interesting to see.
I guess Kash won't agree to another interview with.
Yeah, no, I think those days are over.
Just think about how many fake cases, fake busts the FBI has carried out, fake terror busts. Hundreds of fake terror busts during the war on terror, just to keep the fake war on terror going, where mentally disturbed Muslim men were just set up in manufactured plots by the FBI. That's not weaponization. That's not revenge. The FBI was responsible for the October surprise in the last election, the fake kidnapping plot of Gretchen Whitmer, Michigan governor. Remember that? The FBI managed the entire kidnapping operation through a Michigan militia that was led by paid FBI assets. And the assets who were being paid by the FBI were being told to tell the rest of their low IQ followers that they needed to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer. Then once they were agreed, they were all put on trial, and the plot was revealed in October 2020 to give the impression that Donald Trump was somehow connected to a plot to kidnap a political enemy because these people were seen as Trump supporters. In fact, early on during that plot, that FBI created plot, the FBI told the Michigan State Police to stand down at the Michigan State Capitol. I believe this was March 2020, and allow those gun-toting militiamen to storm in protest of the lockdown measures that had been imposed by Gretchen Whitmer, in order to create a sense of fear and to demonize opponents of lockdowns and as gun-toting fanatics. The FBI is so heavily involved in manipulating American politics and interfering in domestic politics and elections, we don't even know. So any amount of reform would be welcome, but I don't expect Kash Patel to be some great progressive there either. So just put that on the record. We've been living kind of like under an intelligence regime or a kind of national security regime since 9/11, and the FBI has been at the heart of it. And we'll have more to say about that at the Grayzone this week. So definitely watch this space. Moving on. I mean, no one is, unless you want to add anything about Kash or the FBI.
No, it's just, it's just Russiagate never dies. And having spent so much time on it, it's important to remember this is not just about like a domestic political squabble between the Trump camp and his opponents. The most serious impact of all this, I think, was to further undermine relations between the U.S. and Russia, to make it impossible to do diplomacy with Russia and to increase tensions. That, to me, was the main, geopolitical consequence of Russiagate, and we're living it now. And it's made, I think, doing a peace deal inside Ukraine that much more difficult, and we'll see whether it constrains Trump to the extent he wants to do a peace deal. I'm not sure if he even wants to, but it certainly constrained him last time, and we'll see how that plays out again.
Well, the new Cold War continues to escalate. But no one's above the law in the U.S. That's what Nancy Pelosi assured us.
Is above the law. No one is above the law.
Nobody is above the law.
No one is above the law. No one is above the law.
Nobody is above the law.
No one 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 is above the law.
This
Oh, son of a bitch.
That was, in case you don't know, Joe Biden's son-in-law, son outlaw, not son-in-law, outlaw son, Hunter Biden, walking out of a courtroom after being pardoned by Joe Biden, who promised that he would not pardon his son, Hunter Biden. Hunter Biden was convicted of lying on an application an application to own a handgun about being an addict or having been addicted to drugs. Is that right? It was a completely bogus conviction. Jack Smith cooked up.
No. It wasn't Jack Smith, was it?
It wasn't Jack Smith.
I think it was a different special counsel. Yeah.
Okay. All right. The special counsel
is another failed special counsel, but yeah, this is a different one. Yeah.
Okay. Well, a special counsel charged Hunter Biden with kind of a bogus throwaway crime that really, I don't think anyone should be necessarily charged with. If they are charged, it should be like, very low level slap on the wrist. And it's why I support gun regulations and all that. Handgun laws are usually used against the poor in this country. Those who usually get hit with those. But Hunter Biden was given that charge, obviously, in my view, and I just think it's obvious, to avoid investigating and charging him for the real titanic crimes dating back to 2014 that relate to Project Ukraine, the graft, the foreign influence operations that he was involved in through Burisma with, 15% to the big guy, referring to Joe Biden. And in the end, he was pardoned. What are your thoughts on the pardoning of Hunter Biden? Did you expect this?
I guess I'm not surprised by it. My only question to you in your point about Ukraine is sure, what the Bidens were up to in Ukraine is very corrupt, but was it actually illegal given how, legalized corruption has become? So I don't know if Hunter was vulnerable to charges there. Maybe you know more about that than I do, but certainly it's shady. And funnily enough, but actually to your point, which I think bolsters your speculation, Biden's pardon of his son, it doesn't just cover, the crimes he was convicted of, like the tax evasion and the gun charge. It dates back to January 2014. And what happened right after January 2014, the following month, there was a coup in Ukraine, which overthrew the government there, backed by Biden. And a few months after that, that's when Hunter Biden got the lucrative board seat on Burisma. So I guess that's actually an argument for your speculation there about, why these relatively minor charges were brought against Hunter Biden rather than looking back at 2014, which is the period covered by the pardon. So that's interesting. Let me play one more clip of just how corporate media has been covering Joe Biden for a long time now, and his promises not to pardon his son.
Accepted his sentence. He is not pardoning his son.
A little less volume.
Could do. These are federal charges.
Right.
Less volume?
A little less.
Okay, yeah. These MSNBC pundits are too loud for the ears. Fair enough.
He is not doing it because he is living what it means to have a rule of law in this country. Yeah. And then if you want to know if he believes it, you can actually see what is happening with his own son.
The president accepted his sentence.
He is not pardoning.
There we go. And by the way, that's Andrew Weissman, who was a key prosecutor on the Mueller team. So
yeah,
we're talking earlier about Russiagate. So yeah, so
he's living the rule of law.
Yes. Biden's lived experience literally is the rule of law, according to MSNBC. But yeah, so it's funny. This whole thing is funny after this whole thing about Trump being a seismic threat to democracy. He was going to use the pardon power to get his family off the hook, and then Joe Biden goes ahead and does that thing. It's part of Democrats' never-ending humiliation as they're forced to reckon with just the corrupt party that they've become and the scam party that they've become. So it's comical. I also, have to say too, the moral outrage about Biden doing this when he's facilitated a year-long genocide of a defenseless death camp in Gaza. That ranks to me as a much higher moral outrage. I mean, that's an obvious point to make, but I just think that has to be noted. But yeah, it's funny. I mean, it's funny to see.
It's the way Washington works now. Trump installs family members and gives them security clearances, and he would do the same thing for his son. The difference is Trump would just openly say, yeah, my son, I'll pardon him. But Joe Biden was always saying Hunter Biden did nothing wrong. And so, I mean, he's making good on that. Why was he even allowed to say that? Clearly he did some things wrong. And Aaron, there were crimes that also could have been investigated, like possible human trafficking, sexual acts with minors, solicitation on an industrial scale of prostitution, drugs, which don't relate to Ukraine or China. I mean, there were a lot of shady business deals with Devin Archer, a member of the Kerry family, the Kerry Hines family, that, obviously the Biden inner circle, the Biden gang, did not want investigated, which is why Tony Blinken, longtime Biden operative, who I think originally served with Biden on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, mobilized scores of former national security spooks and hacks to claim that his laptop was Russian disinformation, that there was nothing to see in there, because obviously they were afraid of a real investigation. But I think the other point to make here is the Joe Biden we knew, that I grew up with, was a right-wing, tough-on-crime Democrat who was at the forefront of the war on drugs alongside Bill Clinton, and someone who called for bulldozing raves and arresting rave promoters, but who also bragged about how many people he got thrown in jail for selling crack, specifically crack. When is he going to pardon any of those poor people, nonviolent offenders, for selling crack cocaine when his son was on camera?
If you have
this will get us
a
demonetized.
piece of crack cocaine no bigger than this quarter that I'm holding in my hand.
By the way, the footage on the right, this is footage shot by Hunter Biden.
$1/4 of $1. We passed a law through the leadership of Senator Thurmond and myself and others, a law that says you're caught with that, you go to jail for 5 years. You get no probation. You get nothing other than 5 years in jail. Judge doesn't have a choice. Under our forfeiture statutes, the government can take everything you own, everything from your car to your house, your bank account, not merely what they confiscate in terms of the dollars from the transaction that you've just got caught engaging in. They can take everything. I don't care why they become a sociopath. We have an obligation to cordon them off from the rest of society. They are in jail, away from my mother, your husband, our families. So I don't want to ask what made them do this. They must be taken off the street.
I mean, the hypocrisy is just so staggering. And Joe Biden's legacy has been so damaging to people around the world, but also right here in our cities, where he passed laws preventing judges from considering, oh, maybe this young man who's trying to make money off the black market because he's poor has a child, and the child's mother might need him at home, and we could put him out on parole and make sure that he's not going back into drug dealing. No, mandatory 5 years in prison, mandating the seizure by the DEA and FBI of the assets belonging to accused drug dealers. So before they're even convicted, complete violation of the Constitution. Joe Biden was pushing laws that have allowed for people's homes, entire homes, cars, and all their belongings to be stolen and then auctioned off by the DEA, which in itself, it's unconstitutional. It's criminal. Some of these people were found innocent or not guilty. Joe Biden was pushing that. Joe Biden contributed to the crisis in urban America by locking so many people up without consideration for their circumstances. And then at the end of it all, close to the end of his life, because we're going to just watch him drool away the rest of his life when he leaves the White House, after committing the Holocaust of our time, sponsoring a genocide in Gaza, he pardons his own son, who was a titanic, prolific participant in the crack economy, as well as various other, at least petty crimes he could have been convicted of. And when I spent 48 hours in jail for a crime I didn't commit in DC jail, I met a bunch of people who were there for the most minuscule violations, or being accused. There were a few people who were accused of soliciting prostitution. Hunter Biden, he's above the law. The Biden family's above the law. They're also above the ICC.
I want to go to one of my favorite Biden clips. This is about Hunter's work in Ukraine, where Biden was, it was a rare occasion when he was asked, hey, why do you think Hunter Biden was hired for a lucrative energy gas company board seat inside Ukraine? And this is Biden's answer.
Do you think it was wrong for him?
I love this one.
Position, knowing that it was really because that company wanted access to you?
Well, that's not true. You're saying things you do not know what you're talking about. No one said that. Who said that?
Don't you think that it's just one of those things where people think, well, that seems kind of sleazy. Why would he have that job if not for who his father was?
Because he's a very bright guy.
I guess
because he's a very bright guy. And actually, what's funny is that was edited. There's some weird edit there. So they took out something, I don't know what, but it's edited, but they left that part in.
Question I'm kind of asking is, was it right?
His appearance.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he said he regretted having done it.
Yeah. He's a very bright guy. That's why he was given, someone with no experience at all in the energy field was given a lucrative board seat on a Ukrainian energy company a few months after his father's administration backed the overthrow of the government there. And there's all sorts of shady things. And then, of course, Biden goes ahead and brags about getting the prosecutor who was investigating that company, Burisma, fired, and threatening to withhold, $1 billion in U.S. loans to Ukraine unless he was fired. And the question is, why would the U.S. care so much about who is Ukraine's prosecutor general? And is it worth leveraging $1 billion in loans for? Especially after recently that same prosecutor general, and this came out not too long ago, Shokin, he was praised by the Obama administration for doing his job properly. And all of a sudden, Biden changes that tune and threatens to, withhold U.S. loans unless he gets fired. And there were meetings. There were moments when Biden met with people, with Joe Biden, talked to people from Burisma, arranged by his son. So there's all sorts of shady stuff going on there. Is it indictable? I don't know. But now it looks like Hunter Biden's protected from that because of his father's blanket pardon.
I mean, I remember when this was dismissed as disinformation, that this had anything to do with Hunter Biden.
I got all the good ones. So I got Ukraine. And I remember going over convincing our team, our others, to convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, I'm not going to, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting $1 billion. I said, you're not getting $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was 6 hours. I looked, I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Oh, son of a bitch. Got fired.
That was at the Council on Foreign Relations. I remember watching that live and I couldn't believe what I saw, because the prosecutor, Shokin, was looking into Burisma, where his son was getting $80,000 a month as a board member with no experience in gas.
And I recently interviewed Andrei Tilachenko, who actually, I'm sorry if I'm
Great
mispronouncing.
interview.
And he worked actually under Shokin in that office. He's a former Ukrainian diplomat who's become a whistleblower, who's spoken out about the U.S. role in the Maidan coup and the role of people like the Joe Biden in corrupting post-coup Ukraine. And one of the things that Andre told me in the interview is that Shokin, who he worked under, was doing his job, that he wasn't corrupt. That was Andre's opinion. And Andre went on to work in the Ukrainian embassy inside D.C., where he witnessed the collusion with the Democratic Party in trying to, undermine the Trump campaign back in 2016. There's so many layers to this. And, Hunter Biden being pardoned, yeah, that's definitely a part of that story. Because, again, the fact that Joe Biden goes back and retroactively covers 2014, includes that in the period of the pardon, that just raises red lights and red flags. And the fact that Biden, said that that's his Achilles heel. He's such a blowhard and he's so cocky. He has a long record of just blurting out things he's not supposed to say. So there's that where he brags about, basically coercing Ukraine into firing the prosecutor who was investigating his son's company. Then you have the time when he admitted that in Syria, that he complained that U.S. allies, by which he meant the U.S. as well. He didn't admit that part, but U.S. allies were arming an insurgency, he said, that was dominated by Al Qaeda and ISIS. He had to go apologize to Turkey and Qatar and the UAE and Saudi Arabia for that, because you're not supposed to say that. And then the time when, early on after Russia invaded, he gave that speech in Poland, I think, where he said, for God's sakes, this man cannot remain in power, referring to Putin. So he was admitting that his whole aim in Ukraine was to undermine Russia at the point where there's regime change inside Moscow. So that's what Biden is always, he's so cocky and he's so kind of out of it and so just consumed with his own, agenda that he blurts out the truth sometimes. And he makes very clear what his agenda is. And that clip is a good example of it.
Yeah. And then we were just told Shokin's corrupt, and this has nothing to do with his son. Well, then they wouldn't have made the pardon retroactive to 2014. Do you want to do anything on Ukraine?
Well, what's the latest? What's the latest in Ukraine? The big thing happening with Ukraine is so Biden is vowing to Russia
$725 million just stolen from the pockets of U.S. taxpayers and raked from our tax base and sent to Kiev, the most corrupt country in Europe, just today.
Yeah, and Biden's also asked, and this is not getting any attention, Biden's also asked Congress for another $24 billion. He sort of quietly snuck in that request. He wants another $24 billion on top of the at least $182 billion that's already been allocated for the Ukraine proxy war. And the aim is pretty clear. He's afraid that Trump will, force Ukraine to negotiate. So he wants to arm Ukraine as much as he can. There's recently a report in the New York Times saying that U.S. and European officials are considering placing nuclear weapons inside Ukraine. That was just thrown out there in the Times as if that was a real possibility. Jake Sullivan just denied that. But the fact that that's even being put out there, it speaks to the desperation. So Biden's seeking $24 billion from U.S. taxpayers. And what is he asking Ukraine for? Well, he's asking Ukraine to sacrifice younger people. This is the headline from the Associated Press. White House pressing Ukraine to draft 18-year-olds so they have enough troops to battle Russia. So the current conscription age is 25, which was lowered from 27 under U.S. pressure. And now the White House is saying to Ukraine, you need to go and sacrifice younger people. So draft anyone over the age of 18.
And Lindsey Graham's running around with like pieces of paper that just say 18, and he's putting it under their boots so they can be 12 and just technically say they're over 18. He actually did go there demanding they lower the draft age.
Yeah. And and Lindsey Graham's recently been talking about how Ukraine has trillions of dollars worth of minerals, which basically can be used to pay the U.S. back for all its support in Ukraine. And that's what he hopes Trump will try to do. I mean, one of the problems with that is I believe Ukraine's most valuable minerals are in territory now under Russia's control, which, especially after the sabotage of the Minsk Accords and the Istanbul peace agreement in the spring of 2022, I don't think we'll be seeing Russia give back that territory. So, it's basically the same old escalation, fleecing U.S. taxpayers, and sacrificing younger Ukrainians. That's the U.S. playbook.
A lot riding on this war, including NATO's continued expansion. It's existential for NATO. NATO depends on continued expansion for its own existence. And US and European defense, if we can call them defense, arms manufacturers depend on NATO for their own bottom line. And so here's NATO Secretary General on what comes next for Ukraine.
With Sky News, President Zelensky said that the way to stop what he described as the hot phase of the war in Ukraine was for the unoccupied areas of Ukraine to be taken under the NATO umbrella. He said that so far that this was an offer that had not been made officially. So I wonder if you could outline what is the offer that has been made to Ukraine? And in your mind, is it sensible to say that those areas that have been occupied by Russia will invariably end up remaining in Russian hands?
Let me be very firm on this. And here I will quote Zelensky end of February 2022, when some countries offered him a plane to bring him into safety in Poland. And he said, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. I would now argue that Ukraine...
He actually didn't say that. A CIA agent fed that line to the Washington Post.
Doesn't need more ideas on what a peace process could look like. And you and I can sit together and drink a cup of coffee and we can think of many ways how to deal with a peace process whenever that starts. But I would argue, let's not have all these discussions step by step on what a peace process might look like. Make sure that Ukraine has what it needs to get to a position of strength when those peace talks start, when the Ukrainian government has decided they are ready to do so. And that is what we will very much focus on the next 2 days. How to get more military aid into Ukraine, more missile defense into Ukraine, better coordination of everything we are doing, making sure that the command in Wiesbaden will be up and running as soon as possible, that the pledge is implemented. That is what we need to do. So I would say more military aid and less discussions on what a peace process could look like. You and I will...
Let's go back to that one more real quick.
So I would say more military aid and less discussions on what a peace process would look like.
More war, less peace.
Yes.
More money, more money.
And he's so emphatic. He pounds his fist when he says that, more weapons, less talk of peace, which, it's just a new variation of his predecessor's saying. Jens Stoltenberg, what did he say? He said, weapons are the way to peace. That was his mantra. So, I mean, I don't know where they find these people, but no one can conceive of the idea of diplomacy, and no one can recognize the reality that, I mean, they're like, things are only getting worse for Ukraine. They had a really good opportunity with the Minsk Accords, which would have allowed them to keep all their territory. They just would have had to have recognized the rights of ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine, which they refused to do. And then after the war, after the invasion, you had the peace talks in Istanbul. And Russia is not going to give terms that are anywhere or that are as favorable as those. But the alternative is to sacrificing younger people and risking more confrontations, and now with the longer range weapons. But that's the strategy that all these people seem to be behind. And we'll see if Donald Trump offers anything different. He's just appointed Keith Kellogg, who's previously said that in his view, it's the acme of professionalism to use Ukraine to fight Russia because it takes an adversary off the table without us sending our own troops. And it allows the U.S. to focus on China. So that's Keith Kellogg. That was his previous view. Whether he'll change that tune now, we'll find out very soon.
And the one thing they've achieved is to get Russia to test new hypersonic ICBMs in Ukraine, which could be used against NATO targets in Europe, to get Russia to update its nuclear doctrine, to make it easier to wage nuclear war as they continue to relax restrictions on Ukraine striking deep in Russia with missile systems like the ATACMS system, which necessarily requires satellite assistance. And Ukraine doesn't have any satellites. It's British satellites. It's US satellites. Storm Shadow missiles can't be done without some British guy. They're not trained in targeting in Ukraine at this point. So this is a US war. And these psychopaths like Mark Rutte, the last time I saw him, by the way, he was standing outside taking a break outside the Bilderberg conference in Washington, D.C., a secret gathering in which all Five Eyes intelligence chiefs and his predecessor, Jens Stoltenberg, were present alongside global elites and military-minded tech bros like Alex Karp from Palantir, who are doing the AI targeting systems for Ukraine that they're testing there. So there's no way these psychopaths want peace. Then here in Washington, Jane Harmon, whose husband Sidney Harmon was involved in the arms industry, and Eric Edelman, who's just owes his whole career to neocons and is by no means a scholar, but I think he became the head of SICE, the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, which is the neocon training mill. They have this Congressional Commission on National Defense Strategy, and I read the summary of their report. They're calling for a massive increase in the U.S. defense budget, which is now at what, like $900 billion a year, to several trillion a year. And to accomplish that, they want huge cuts in entitlements and benefits to the American public, which are already weak by any first world standard, and massive tax increases. And they're willing to see inflation increase even further to have this massive military buildup to fight Russia and China. So they're putting forward these reports in Washington without any challenge. These are dangerous people, and the US public has already paid the price. Inflation, one of the biggest reasons. Actually, there's a good piece in The Nation by Branko Marcetic on how the Ukraine proxy war has driven inflation. Biden attempting to turn the ruble to ruble. Of course, it caused inflation because it raised the price of gas. We were paying the NATO price hike on gas, which had knock-on effects on fertilizer and the price of food. And we, no matter what, even though they say, oh, the Fed has stuck the landing in the US, we're still paying the price. Everybody can feel it. It's a major reason why Trump got elected. And I don't want to guarantee anything, but I doubt Trump is going to do anything about inflation or be able to.
Yeah.
Especially now that he's pushing, tariffs and trade wars with Mexico and China.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons, I mean, again, I'm not an economist, but it's like, we know that Russia is still selling its gas. It has to now go through like third parties because some European countries don't want to can't buy it from Russia directly because that just looks too bad. So they get it routed from other countries, which then raises the price because the other countries are now taking a cut as well. So, but in this effort to look tough against Russia and hold the line and have a united front as if we're all standing up to Russia, even Russia still gets to sell its energy. It just makes more money off of it. And other people take a cut too, which raises prices for the consumer. And I'm sure, I mean, just given how the world market works, there's been a knockoff, like a spell-off impact here in the US. And then you have the fact that also you have the regime change policy in Venezuela, which, because the government of the US has been trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela. And I haven't kept track. I mean, Anya covered this in her book. I haven't kept track of what the latest is, but as I understand, the US is still imposing sanctions on Venezuela's oil industry and is not buying as much Venezuelan oil as it could, if at all. So that's going to raise prices for people as well. So that's how these proxy wars, these regime change efforts hurt, average taxpayers in the US, beyond the fact that their tax money goes towards funding these wars like in Ukraine and in Palestine.
And the Ukraine war is also seen as a means of weakening Iran and weakening the axis of resistance. So it's a global war. It's World War III. And that's another incentive for NATO to continue flooding Ukraine with arms as long as they can find enough warm Slavic bodies to throw into the slaughterhouse. I mean, there's no price to any Americans. I think this will be one of the biggest political wars within the Trump administration, because they're going to come under so much pressure if they attempt to negotiate. And Keith Kellogg as the Ukraine envoy, that's a disaster. That is a disaster. I mean, this is a guy who is called, at one point, he appeared to be calling for, the U.S. to send troops into Ukraine. He has called for Americans to prepare to fight China directly over Taiwan. He is a militarist, Strangelovian fanatic. Why would Trump pick Keith Kellogg? Also kind of a dolt. Anya owned him in a Twitter exchange on that. And I mean, he was responding, and his responses were, he should have relied on an advisor. I guess this is what happens when you're out of government, is you get bored. And
he's also 80 years old.
He's 80.
Yeah.
So maybe he'll have a Mueller moment when he goes before the press. I don't know why Trump picked him.
It's hard to make sense of a lot of Trump's choices going back to when he was in office last time, when he picked a bunch of people who, you know, undermined him at every turn, like John Bolton and many others, Nikki Haley. But, you know, Trump, you know, his agenda is pretty clear to me. He just wants to be liked by his rich friends. I think that's his main motivator here. And certainly he does want to take revenge on people who tried to undermine him, you know, through Russiagate and other means. But aside from that, I don't think he cares about much else.
That's the way it seems. Well, I'm kind of getting dizzy under these studio lights. I wanted to do something on Georgia, but I feel like we should do it properly. The French-born president of Georgia is refusing to step down, even though she's lost parliamentary elections. She's calling that illegitimate. The Western-backed NGO forces in Tbilisi are staging a Maidan-style operation, which makes January 6th look like a Shriners parade. And they're being cheered on. This is very democratic. It's a great day for democracy. I believe South Korea declared martial law. Love to hear an update from Yeonmi Park on what's happening there. But there's so much more to cover. I think we're going to have to do it next week, unless there's anything you want to add.
No. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. The ways to support the Grayzone are there on the screen. And it sounds like Max will be having an investigation coming out at the Grayzone soon on something that sounds pretty interesting. I guess we can't say more than that, but stay tuned to the Grayzone.
Yeah, we're definitely a source of drama. What was the last drama? Oh, Jeremy Lafredo being effectively tortured by Israel. So
yeah, that was a good one.
We'll have something that was horrifying. We'll have something new. Also, thank you all for those of you who donated to Jeremy. He's going to be out in the field reporting soon. As soon as I get off here, we're going to talk about his next project. Thanks to all of you supporting the kind of unique investigative reporting that we're doing, supporting people like Hekmat, who joined us, Hekmat Abuat, to provide analysis on Syria. And as I said, we'll be back next week. So like this stream, subscribe, sign up for our newsletter so you get everything in your inbox, and support any way you can. We'll see you next time. Peace.
Peace.